For the German people, the new year brought changes that were spectacular, dramatic.
This was real, it was a miracle.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 sparked a revolutionary wave around the world where citizens started calling for a move from autocracy to democracy, and Kenya was not left behind. Take a look at these pictures. These are images from the 7th of July 1990, when young Kenyans took to the streets to protest against Moi's dictatorship, corruption, abuse of power and abuse of office, and obviously oppression. There was a lot of human rights violations, unemployment, poverty. People are not allowed to express and impart ideas like I'm doing now. And obviously there was police brutality, and election rigging had become the norm. But Kenyans had come to the realization that for them to have a decent future and a fair shot at this in this country, something had to change, and that was definitely the leadership.
1990.
But 31 years later, things changed, but they remained the same. In fact, the most important thing to note about this is that some of the people who fought at the forefront of this second liberation are the same people who are going to bed with the impunity that is the political class of today. And I think, guys, we need a third liberation. Hi, my name is Susan Wanjiko. I'm the founder of Wanjiko's Eye, and today I want to focus on human rights in the Kenyan context, and specifically the roles and obligation of the government to the citizens, so that you can understand, engage, and influence the matters that affect you and I. Welcome to Wanjiko's Eye. So welcome back to this channel. Thank you so much for the support I've received so far. It's evident that there's a lot of demand for political education. If it's your first time here, welcome, and make sure you watch the first part of this series where I introduce the concept of human rights, and I also give the evolution. And before I get into the roles and obligations of the state, I want us to remember something very important. The fight for independence and the fight for the second liberation were all human rights causes. For example, the fight for independence was a fight to the right to self-determine. That's for us to decide as Kenyans, how do we want to progress and develop economically, socially, and even culturally. And the right and freedom also from oppression. There was a lot of oppression, obviously, during the colonial times. And the fight for the second liberation was a fight for the rights and freedoms of Kenyans as recognized in Kenya to be expanded. So, a majority of the rights that we currently enjoy today is because of the second liberation, and also because of the fight for independence. So make sure you remember that. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Our rights and freedoms as Kenyans are contained in Chapter 4 of the Kenyan Constitution under the Bill of Rights, and it's a very elaborate section. I would encourage all of you to go and read it so that you can know your rights. And there are over 40 rights and freedoms contained in that chapter, so I don't really want to focus on each of the rights. Like I said, all the rights are interdependent, so I'll spend too much time on human rights if I focus on citizen to citizen relationships. So I really want to focus on the government to citizens. So obviously the rights have been expanded to freedom of religion, freedom of movement and residence, freedom of association, consumer rights, land rights, employee rights, and managing the employee and employer relationships, so labor rights. So just go out and check out that chapter, and make sure you know your rights. Every government has its own plans and agenda to do and to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve. And most of the time it usually revolves and falls either in provision of public services, that could be building roads, bridges, providing water and sanitation, or it could be coming in by ideally coming to solve the economic development challenges that are already existing in the society. And in the Kenyan context, it's either at a national level or a county level. So essentially they're coming to fix, ideally, that's the plan. They're coming to fix what's not functioning, or if there are any gaps, they also come in to fix it. Nonetheless, when governments come in, life is already going on. Either people are employed, others are in school, others have businesses, life is just happening for people. So when a government is coming in, they have the role and obligation to respect, protect, and to fulfill human rights. And by respecting, that means that they should not do anything to interfere with the enjoyment of our basic human rights. And they should also do everything in their power to protect our rights from being violated, either by a private citizen or a public servant. And they should also fulfill, and that means to take proactive measures to make sure that we actually do enjoy our human rights. And that now comes into the issue of fixing economic development challenges. So ideally they're coming in to fix, but that's not usually the situation on ground. So when they're doing whatever it is that they want to do, whether it's providing affordable housing, improving security, maintaining law and order, fighting terrorism, making sure that children transition from primary to high school, whatever it is, they have to take very many factors into consideration. So they usually achieve their agenda, whatever it is that they set out to do, either using laws and policies and regulations, and then now allocating resources to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve. Regardless, remember, like I said, they already found us existing and going on with life. So they have very, very many factors to consider as they undertake whatever it is that they want to do. For example, if it's a policy, they need to ask themselves, how effective is this policy going to be in solving the problem that they're trying to solve? And will there be any unintended consequences? And also they need to think about, will the policy be acceptable? If it's not acceptable, sometimes it might cause the citizens to perceive that, not to accept the government, and that's usually very dangerous for the stability of a country. And they also need to figure out, how is this, whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, going to be financed? So let me put it into perspective. For example, the roads. So these roads, obviously where they're being built, there are people around there. And you're not just building a road for the sake of building a road. Either you're solving an inefficiency problem, is there traffic, is it just that the place is inaccessible because there are no roads? So they need to figure out, what problem is this road solving, and is it effective in solving that particular problem? Then they also need to know, how is it going to affect different groups of people? Is it going to be a tarmac road? Are they just going to put stones? Because not everyone is driving. And then they also need to figure out how it's going to be financed. Is there money? If there's no money, does it need to be borrowed? If it needs to be borrowed, what does that mean again for other sectors in the economy? So they have a lot to figure out. Then even we can look at a most recent development that, again, like I said, has policies have to build consensus. So let's talk about the curfew. So the curfew was initially intended to solve and prevent the spread of COVID. So that was, they needed to figure out how effective is the curfew in preventing the spread of COVID. And at the same time, how acceptable is this curfew given the current economic conditions? Like we know in Kenya, a majority of people work in the informal sector, over 80%. So that means that most people really can't work from home. And because of the curfew, again, businesses can't really operate efficiently. Then an unintended consequence, people are killed of police brutality. So the government should have been able to foresee such a circumstance, because police brutality is not a new thing in this country. So the fact that over about 6 people were killed in the first 10 days of curfew, can you believe that? That's before COVID ever killed anyone in this country. So those are some of the things that they need to figure out ideally. So what does the Kenyan Constitution say about the principles of public service? That's when governments are doing whatever it is that they want to do. Article 232 of the Kenyan Constitution says that the values and principles of public service include high standards of professional ethics, efficient, effective, and economic use of resources, responsive, prompt, effective, impartial, and equitable provision of services, involvement of the people in the process of policy making, accountability for administrative acts, and transparency and provision to the public of timely, accurate information. There's another very important role that the government comes into play, which is leveling the playing field. Let's face the fact, we live in a very unequal world. I know we say all human beings are born equal, but we humans are the same people who create those inequalities. So again, depending on your tribe or the family that you come from or your race or which part of the country that you're born in, you might not be able to get the same economic opportunities as opposed to your other counterparts who are of a different race or gender or tribe or from a certain particular family. And that again speaks to being able to live life to your fullest potential, because again, the advantages that we have in the course of our lives are the ones that propagate us either to success or to not being very successful, or to just ending up in a vicious cycle of poverty. Like, let's take these two kids for example, and let's take in this picture just for a few moments. These two kids have two completely different and contrasting lives, but the reality of life is that the chances of their success and the chances of them being able to live their lives to their fullest potential all depends on the advantages that they have in this life at different stages of their life. So let's call one rich kid and one poor kid, as I explained, just for the sake of reference. So it's a bit evident and obvious that we can assume that the rich kid probably has 3 meals a day and even has some snacks in between, and the kid from a poor background probably has no meal or probably goes with 1 meal a day. So nutrition and food, freedom from hunger, is very important for the sake of concentration. And again, concentration is very important for the sake of performance. So if you work back, you can tell you probably will not be able to perform if you can't concentrate, and you can't concentrate if you've not been well fed or if you're hungry. So again, the performance will determine how they move from primary school to secondary school. So again, given the example of the Kenyan context, your grades and marks really matter, especially if you're doing the 844 system. So if you haven't performed well, you might not go to the best schools. I'm really speaking in general terms. I know some people go to schools that are not so good and they still perform, but those are exceptions, they're not the rule. And yeah, so the kid from a well-off background, even if they don't perform well, or if they perform well, they go to a good school. If they're not performing well, the folks, the parents, might be able to afford, or will be able to afford, to get connections to have them go to the best schools, or even move to now a private school if public school is not working. So just from that one scenario, a government can reduce the inequality. If the kid doesn't have food in school, the programs like Food for Education, we see private citizens stepping in to solve that issue. If it's a fee issue, the government can provide free primary education, and they can do that even to other higher levels of education. So these kids, as they come to their productive years, that's 18 and onwards, again, they'll be competing for the same things, the same slots in university. One might not even be able to afford university. And the world that we live in, most of the time, if you don't have tertiary level education, you might not really be able to make it out of that vicious cycle. There's just some skills that come with knowledge. Again, like I said, the ones who are able to do so are the exception and not the rule, because the system was just designed that way. It's bad, we know, but it is what it is. So again, they're all competing for the same opportunities. So you can see one might end up being locked in a vicious cycle of poverty just because they were unable to either perform well in school, or the folks were not able to afford school fees to take them to higher levels of education. Then now they're not able to get productive jobs. If they can't get productive jobs, the salaries and incomes that they get might not really be enough to push them to save and invest, plus also fend for their families. So you see, they end up in that cycle, and then it just usually perpetuates to other generations. So yeah, the government really plays a huge role when it comes to leveling the playing field. Therefore, as they apply and enact any law, or as they make and implement any public policy decision, this is what Article 10 of the Kenyan Constitution says on the principles of governance. Article 10, Section 2B of the Kenyan Constitution says that the national values and principles of governance include human dignity, equity, social justice, inclusiveness, equality, human rights, non-discrimination, and the protection of the marginalized. And like I said, the fact is we do not live in a fair world. You'll probably be discriminated for your gender, your race, or your tribe, well, because of the family that you come from. And that's why the Kenyan Constitution has guided the politicians and the MPs and the leaders to come up with affirmative action programs to take care of this discrimination and inequality, which is just unfairness, or the barriers that will probably prevent people from progressing in their lives, whether economically or whatever, and which actually give other people an unfair advantage. So some of these affirmative action programs are, for example, the Youth Enterprise Fund, the Equalization Fund, to make sure that the most marginalized communities have at least the basics of public utilities. We have the Youth Development Fund, and also some legal requirements, for example, like government procurement opportunities, demanding that 30% of all government procurement opportunities to go to youth, women, and persons with disabilities. There's a very good reason that the Kenyan Constitution is very specific on the guidelines and principles to public service and how to lead this country, because the challenges of economic development are not straightforward at all, and they're usually very complex. So most of the time you might think that you're fixing one problem when in essence you are creating like 10 other problems behind that. So if you're not very careful, you could really destroy an entire economy by just doing one wrong thing. And destroying an economy is essentially and basically destroying people's lives. So if they don't do this, a majority of the time you'll see three situations occurring. If they don't manage resources efficiently, if they don't allocate resources properly, and again, if they just don't take care of human rights, if they're not making sure that the citizens have the basics So one thing you will often notice when a government is not doing the right thing is that you will notice that there are very gross inequalities, like the extremes of extreme advantage and extreme disadvantage. So most of the time when we're referring to income inequalities, there are some people who are very, very rich and there are others who are very, very poor. So let's look at these examples of some counties in this country that we compare and contrast. You'll see that some countries, you won't even think that this is Kenya. So let's have a look at that. Again, if they don't consider everything that I've mentioned, normally they create a situation where they provide potential grounds for incitement to violence against particular groups of people. So for example, when we're heading towards elections every time, you can see our politicians going into their tribal cocoons to incite their tribes or other groups of people that because X and X is in power, that community are benefiting and having unfair advantages because one of their own is in power. So because a Kikuyu is in power, it's perceived that all Kikuyus are thriving because a Kikuyu is in power, which is normally very far from the truth. So that's another situation that they create, and that's why a majority of the time it becomes so tense when we are headed towards elections. It's normally a thing, an issue of resource allocation a majority of the time. So if resources were allocated efficiently and they were used for whatever it is that they were meant for, we would not have these issues in the first place. Finally, the other thing that happens when they fail to consider again all these things and just use resources badly or just steal is that they create a conundrum of policy. They put themselves between a rock and a hard place, especially when they're faced in a crisis. For example, there are times when you'll need to borrow, but if you borrow when you don't need to borrow, when the time to borrow comes, you will not be able to borrow. Or if you borrow, you end up destroying an entire economy. Or let me use a much simpler example because I don't want to touch on debt right now. I will touch debt as a single topic on its own. Let me come to an issue that is more moral than legal. I'll use the case of Gengetone. And just for the sake of the older generations, let's just see a bit of Gengetone for the sake of reference. So these musicians of Gengetone have been the subject of a lot of criticism from Deputy Jesus. Again, for the sake of reference, this is Deputy Jesus. So Deputy Jesus, I think, has gone to the extent of sometimes banning some of the songs produced by these artists by saying that they're contributing to the moral rot in society. But truth be told, some of these musicians who are producing this music in Gengetone are kids from very, very poor backgrounds, and some of them have come from the slums. And this music that they have produced is the only thing that actually has given them a chance to live a life of dignity and a life to even be able to compete effectively and to make their own living. So again, this is a moral issue and it's not a legal issue. In fact, I think if we really want to talk about morality, we should talk about the theft in this country if morality really is an issue, because anyway, that usually affects tens of millions of lives. But again, like I said, it creates a conundrum in policy. So this guy goes ahead to ban the music, and this music is what they depend on for their livelihood. So, which makes sense? Ban their music and leave them unemployed, or for the sake of morality, or fix the economy, then you can go ahead and ban their music, because anyway, in a functional economy, they will have the freedom of choice. They'll be able to find another decent way to make a living, because, well, the economy will be fully functional. So you see, it creates such a conundrum, because in society, again, societies are so complex. You really need to take into consideration all those social and economic and cultural factors. So in a moral police society like Kenya, which comes first? Does it make sense to ban this guy's music when you are essentially throwing them back into unemployment? And again, we consume immoral international music, so such conundrums are what they create when they make bad decisions for an economy. So in conclusion, the Constitution is very clear that there are guiding principles to how politicians should lead the country and guiding principles to public service. That human rights and human dignity should be at the core of every single decision, every law, every public policy choice that the government decides to make. This is because any law, any policy, any regulation is the difference between someone being able to afford the basics, which is health, education, housing, food, getting water, living in a clean environment, getting security, and the difference between them not having any of that. These laws, again, are also the difference between someone being able to start their business or being employed, or the difference between them not being able to. So I think by now it's very clear that the government of the country that you're living in is a huge determinant in your success in that particular country. So if you have a bad government, chances are you'll not be able to live to your fullest potential, and your choices will be limited just by the mere fact of the consequences of the choices that the government makes. And if you live in a country where the government is good, is transparent, is accountable to the people, there's a high chance that you'll be able to live life to the fullest potential. You'll have many choices at your fingertips. You can decide if you want to be a musician today or a banker, or you can even decide to be both. You're not just limited to just one thing. So remember one thing, that all these rights that we enjoy today are something that the people who fought for independence and some of the people who lost their lives in the fight for the second liberation, these are rights that they could only have imagined. So that's why we should do everything in our power to protect our rights. So the assignment for this second part of human rights is go and read chapter 4 of the Kenyan Constitution. I have attached a link, so be proactive, go and know your rights, and at the same time make sure you at least find out one right that really piques your interest, and find out what other private citizens are doing in their personal capacity to make Kenya a better place. You can figure out if your interest is in security matters, if it's in education, in food, in hunger, in law. We saw some young Kenyans in the fight against BBI. So you go and figure out which right piques your interest. Go and be proactive. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure you like, you share and subscribe. I'll see you in the final bit of this human rights series, where I will just call a spade a spade. I will not leave anything to chance. I will just say everything that's been happening. Well, I'll cover most of what's been happening with regards to human rights in Kenya. Cheers.